Hey gang, welcome back to Ken Michaels Radio. Beatles is what we talk about here. The group years, the solo years, the news, anything we feel like talking about. And I have a very special guest to introduce to you. His name is Scott Freiman. And ever since 2009, he has put together this series called Deconstructing the Beatles, which I'd heard about but never fully investigated. A few months ago, I was channel surfing and I found on PBS it said Deconstructing the Beatles. Ooh, I got to check this out. Scott was on the show. It was all about the Rubber Soul album. And also, there was another show that PBS ran. It was all about Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane, another part of Deconstructing the Beatles. And he's actually going to be bringing one of his shows to the Schubert Theater, the very famous Schubert Theater in New Haven, Connecticut, next Thursday, which is November the 20th. And it starts at 7 p.m. And so I thought, why not talk about this whole series and what folks will have in store for the show coming up in a week. So, Scott, welcome to the channel.
Thank you so much for having me, Ken.
So tell me how this whole thing started. I know you said to me 2009 was the year that you came developed this idea.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if, because 2009 was the big year for the Beatles remastered CDs coming out,
Hmm.
also the Beatles Rock Band.
Yes.
What you do in your series is you tell the story how each song was recorded, but you also play isolated tracks. And I'm figuring 2009, this was starting to come into the fold, this whole idea of hearing isolated tracks. Were you thinking this would be the right time for a series like this?
So it was really not anything planned, to be completely candid. It was just something I was doing for me, right? I had grown up listening to the Beatles. I was always fascinated by them. I read every book from the Nicholas Schaffner book to all the biographies. I got the Beatles recording sessions, Mark Lewison, which changed Beatles, writing and journalism and analysis so much. But I was a musician, but I wasn't a producer. And so a lot of the concepts I didn't really get. I didn't understand. I didn't really know what they all meant. And then cut forward to 2001, I moved to New York. I started a career as a producer. I have
Oh,
my own studio, and I got out some of my books, and now I was reading them, and now I was understanding. But now I wanted to hear what they were talking about. So when Mark Lewison said, a day in the life on track one, John did X, Y, and Z, I wanted to hear that.
right.
And around that time, and my best recollection is it had something to do with the Love Show in Vegas, but it could also have been rock, right? It was right before Rock Band or right around the time Rock Band was being made. And four tracks had found their way into bootleg circles of, I think it was Sergeant Pepper, With a Little Help from My Friends, Lucy in the Sky, and A Day in the Life. Just
Mm.
those four kind of isolated tracks. And I got out my book. I had Recording the Beatles by that point, the Cahoon and Ryan book, my Mark Lewison book, and these isolated tracks. And I thought, wow, this is cool. I got to get some friends over to hear this stuff.
Right.
And so I had a lot of producer friends and composer friends in the city. I invited them out so they could check out my studio. And I said I would put on a talk about the Beatles. And I designed this whole presentation on Sergeant Pepper. And I did a lot more investigation. I found some other tracks. I did some stuff in Pro Tools and put together this talk really just for these friends.
Uh-huh.
And 10 minutes into the presentation, they started saying, when are you going to do this again? And would you come teach my college class? And there's a theater out on Long Island that does this stuff. Have you thought about presenting this? I hadn't thought about anything other than this was kind of cool for me. And I thought some of my music friends would like it. And then that led to me starting to do some talks about Sergeant Pepper in small community theaters. They referred me to other theaters. And the audience always wanted to know, well, when are you going to do the White Album? When are you going to do Abbey Road? And I was like, oh, I guess I have to, keep doing this. It just
Right.
kind of took off. Then they were turned into films. And I thought, there's no way I'm going to be able to do a movie with Beatles music. And I was taught about fair use licensing, and we found some attorneys so that we checked out everything we do is under fair use. I've released 11 films, And then I was approached about a PBS series. So this whole thing started because I was wanting to match up what I was reading and what I was hearing. And it just turned out that lots of people like this stuff, as you know. So it's been a lot of fun.
So many questions I want to ask you, but you know, this is prime time. We've been fortunate ever since the Beatles anthology series came out to hear outtakes of Beatles songs. I mean, putting them out legally. And then you've got all the archival box sets that have come out from Sergeant Pepper, starting with Sergeant Pepper, last with Revolver, waiting for more. And
Hmm.
so you're getting outtakes, you're hearing some isolated tracks, but there's always going to be a lot of holes there of stuff that you're never going to hear that you've read about.
That's
How
right.
do you fill in the gaps for that?
Well, you fill in the gaps as much as you can based on people who were at the session, Beatles Book Monthly, the recording sessions, documentation from Mark Lewison. I have some notes from George Martin that were in a library, and people on the web who are trying to figure out what guitar George Harrison played. And it's forensic musicology is what I call it. It's really trying to solve. It's not a crime but solve a puzzle. How was this song put together? Who played what? How was it laid out on the track sheet, on the tape player? How did they get those sounds and effects? And then, surprisingly, there's still more to come. These box sets have been really interesting. A lot of the tracks I had heard, maybe not in as good quality,
Hmm.
but there was also a lot I hadn't heard. Like I knew there was a take one of Love Me Too, which was released on the Revolver box set, but I'd always wanted to hear that.
Hmm.
But very few people knew that John Lennon had done a demo of Yellow Submarine. That was always a Paul song.
Hmm.
So that kind of blew me away. So the every time I give a talk, I I update it, I edit it, based on both my audience and also what is new and out there. And sometimes I revise things that I've said before. And sometimes I say, hey, this is still a controversy. We don't know whether that was Paul or John or George or Ringo, what have
We might get to that later on.
you.
But still, even with the archival box sets, there's controversy as to what Kevin Howlett's written. And, how can you say no to Kevin Howlett? How can you say no
Exactly,
to Mark
exactly.
Lewis? And even the best authors make
Yes.
mistakes. There are errors out there. I know that in recent years, apart from the Beatles recording sessions, I've read Jerry Hammack's series
Hmm. Hmm.
on Beatles recordings, and for me, it was a real eye opener because he had charts there, much like what you do, where he breaks down each song and tells you what was played on track one, what was played on track two, what was transferred over. What's the word when you take a couple of tracks and you mix it down?
Bouncing or tape to tape
Bouncing, you
reduction.
know, and he showed that on his pages there. So
Uh-huh.
is that, have you looked at his books and have they been helpful?
Yes, but there are many times where I will have Mark Lewison, Walter Everett, Bruce
Uh-huh.
Spicer, Jerry Hammack, and they all say different things. And this is where the fun comes because there are mistakes in these books that are what I will call uh, uh, obvious mistakes, meaning that all you need to do is listen to the recording. And if you have any knowledge of how recording works, you know that Ringo couldn't have played maracas and tambourine at the same time.
Hmm.
It couldn't have been done unless it was an overdub, and he couldn't have overdubbed it because he was playing the drums. And so someone else had to play tambourine. And it couldn't have been Paul because that's when they overdubbed the bass. And it couldn't have been John because he was doing this, so it had to be George. And you'll find in these books no mention of the tambourine at all. Or Ringo played tambourine and maracas. And I will listen to the recording. I will listen to even the very simplest mixes without isolating tracks. But the left channel and the right channel, and the way recording was done, the four tracks that the Beatles mixed on for most of their career, each track had to go either to left or right, pretty much.
Hmm.
And so you couldn't, if you have two things on the left channel, they were on uh, they couldn't have been on different tracks, basically, or that's not exactly right. Um, Basically, you can deduce some things by where they're panned in the stereo spectrum. But a lot of times you'll find, Mark Lewison doesn't mention that there is someone tapping. There's a third guitar part, and Hammock has two people playing guitar, and Walter Everett says, there were three people playing guitar, and you listen to the track, and you have to figure out, are these three separate parts? Were they played together? Was one person, was Paul playing all the parts or whatever? And there's no, some of the puzzles are quite intense. Um,
Tell me.
there's a great podcast. Yeah, there's a great podcast out called Gear. I'm forgetting the name, but it's a podcast of these guys who try and replicate the sounds of the instruments. And what they do is they bring out different instruments and different amps, and they then try and figure out which one sounds the most like the recording, and they isolate the guitars from the recording. And by that, and by what instruments were purchased, so I also use the Beatles gear book
Uh,
um, to try and find out, did they actually own an Epiphone Casino at that point? And
hmm.
so it is a lot of fun. But I've spent 3 days on a single song, just trying to figure out if there's some kind of something I'm missing, some clue that tells me whether it was George or Paul who played this solo. And it's part of the fun.
You mind if I dwell on this for just a couple of
Not
minutes?
at all, not at all. And I want to look up that podcast because I feel bad I didn't mention the name. So give me 1 second, and I will tell you that. Um, it's called Gear There and Everywhere.
Okay, I
A
think I've.
wonderful YouTube channel. Definitely suggest you check it out.
Okay, let me mention she said, she said.
Okay,
You know where I'm going with this.
I do. I do.
It's been said that Paul walked out on the session, even he admitted it.
Yes,
So the question is, who's playing the bass? Is it
right.
Paul or is it George Harrison? When I spoke to Jerry Hammock about it, when his book came out, he said it has to be Paul.
Hmm.
Because if Paul walked out and they had to redo everything, the bass and the drum were on the same track, which would mean that you'd have to redo the drums too. And everything was done for expediency. So they had to get things done quickly, so they most likely used Paul's bass.
Yes.
What's your feeling on that?
So I need to pull up my notes, but here's the thing about that. Around the time of Revolver, Paul is overdubbing his bass. He's not playing it with the rest of the group for most of the tracks. I don't know about She Said, She Said. There's a disclaimer there. But typically, what was happening was he was coming in so he could do some really intricate bass parts. He started doing that on Rubber Soul,
Hmm.
and if you notice how different his bass is on that album, all of a sudden there are these really cool melodic lines. Well,
Hmm.
that's because he got some time to think about it and work on it and overdub them separately, and he could redo it without erasing the rhythm track. So oftentimes during Revolver, they would record drums and guitars on track one, and then Paul would overdub his bass on another track.
Okay.
So I'd have to pull up my Revolver presentation to see my latest latest thinking on that. But it is very clear that Paul walked out of the session. The other thing about that bass part is it is a very, very simple bass part.
Hmm.
And again, Ringo at this point, I mean Paul at this point is playing much more elaborate presentations. Um, and he's doing much more elaborate things on the bass. And so the fact that this part is simple is a little out of character for Paul.
Hmm.
So uh, it's one of those controversies that we don't know. And I'll pull up the track sheet here while we're talking. I have it right here. Um, and yeah, so I think I came to the conclusion that it was not Paul. But again, I have to revisit that. I'm actually working on a book right now with Ken Womack, going song by song, and that's where I'm really spending a lot of time doing this investigation. And So that's one of the controversies I'm going to explore in detail.
Does Ken Womack ever have a day off?
He does not. Yeah, I when I speak to him, and because we do a monthly class called the Fab Four Master Class, we lead trips to Europe. We speak together, and every time I call him, he says, "Yes, I'm just finishing off this other book." It's like, Ken, what other book? You know, he's pretty amazing. He's pretty amazing.
You could say that again. I mean, so impressed with him. All right, one song that's a complete mess. Old Brown Shoe.
Yes.
According to Kevin Howlett's notes, since Old Brown Shoe was recorded the day after the Ballad of John and Yoko, Ringo was still filming The Magic Christian. He was away. So Paul did the drumming. Okay. So, and then you hear that George Harrison said that he played the bass on it. When I hear the bass line, that sounds so much like Paul. And a lot of it's very fast. And I'm not sure if George could have played it. But what's your feeling about that with the drums and with the bass?
Uh, I'm not going to comment on that because I don't know. I don't have my notes on that, so I don't
Okay.
have that offhand.
We'll have to do a whole show on just that one song.
We'll have to you'll have to give me some time to get my notes together on this. So I've been so immersed in Rubber Soul and the early albums, but yeah, but Old Brown Shoe, the piano is George, which was very unusual because he typically did not play piano, but but that part he loved the dissonance on the piano that he could get that he couldn't do on the same on guitar because you can't play really two half steps on a guitar together you can't do it on the same string. You'd have to do it on separate strings. And on the piano you can. So he loved that for Old Brown Shoe.
And you saw him playing the piano when they jammed on the song and Get Back, which was real.
Exactly. Exactly. Yes. Yes.
Okay, so before we get to Rubber Soul, I want to give the folks watching a taste of what you do, showing what's on the screen as you do this. And again, for those of you who are wondering, we're going to talk about Rubber Soul because Scott Show will be on Rubber Soul, the one coming up next. He does a lot of different shows, but the one next week on Thursday at the Schubert Theater will be on Rubber Soul. But you're going to show us something on Come Together and what you do.
Yes. 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 So let me share my screen here. And I will so share screens. Okay. So can you see that, Ken?
The two pictures of Paul.
Yes, exactly. So,
Okay.
one of the things there's so many great things about Abbey Road, but so many differences from the other albums. They're using a new mixer called the TG12345, which is a digital mixer, no more vacuum tubes, and a lot more control over all the tracks. And you really hear that on Ringo's drums. It's a very tom heavy album. And the sound of the tom toms is great, and Paul's bass sounds great. It sounds very different than earlier albums. And one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is the connection between Come Together and Dr. John. So Dr. John's album, The Gree had just come out. And for those of you who don't know, Dr. John was a session musician, played with the Wrecking Crew, played with Frank Zappa, really well known, especially on the West Coast, but he was a New Orleans guy. And he invented this persona of the night tripper and did these albums that were, very steeped in Cajun music. And when Come Together came in from John, it very much sounded like a Chuck Berry song. In fact, that opening line comes from a Chuck Berry song. So Paul said, we really got to get away from Chuck Berry. And it was Paul's idea to kind of slow it down, make it kind of a swampier feel.
Mhm.
And I just got a little taste of Gree. And if you listen to this, you can imagine in your head speeding it up just slightly, and you get Come Together.
They call me Dr. John, known as the Night Tripper.
So think of the riff of Come Together, right?
Gree-grees in my hand.
And then, like, even the
They
lyrics,
tripping up.
juju eyeball,
Back down
mojo
the
filter.
bayou.
That's right out of Dr. John's
I'm the
lyrics,
last
you know?
of the best. They
So
call me
they
the
were definitely
Green
listening to
Man.
that. But what's interesting is they're working with 8-track tape now. This is the first album that's going to be done entirely on 8-track tape. So
Uh-huh.
why am I showing a 4-track here, right? So the day that they come together, the day after Neil Armstrong lands on the moon, Studio 2 is occupied. And they have to start in Studio 3 because they want to get going. And they don't have an 8-track recorder. They only have a 4-track recorder. And so take one, which I'm going to play a little bit of, we've got bass, guitar, drums, and vocal. And they're all on the separate tracks. And the Beatles are going to mix this down or bounce this down to an 8-track after this take, but they start on 4-track. So before anything's layered on, here's what it sounds like.
He's roller coaster, he got early warning, he's got Doris Duckers. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
So you can hear John yelling shoot, which I'll talk about in a moment. Shoot me, he's saying.
He come all flat top, he come grooving up slowly. He got choo-choo eyeballs, he's one holy roller. He's got head down to his knees. He's got to be a joker, he just do what he please.
So that, of course, is a temporary vocal that John's putting on for the moment. But he's saying at the beginning, in these introductions, he's saying "shoot me," which is, of course, is horribly ironic, knowing how John passed. But it could have been. It's possibly related to drugs, but more than likely, it's just something he thought sounded kind of cool to start. But what happens is when they record the final version, they're adding echo to his voice.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's not only saying shoot me, he's clapping his hands. And when he does that with the echo, instead of hearing him say shoot me, you hear shh, right? You just hear him say the shh. And
Yeah.
I'm going to isolate that. And you can absolutely hear that he was saying shoot me, but you're only getting the shush sound.
Right.
And stop me with questions, Ken, by the way.
Well, before you continue,
Yes.
is there any evidence? I know Ringo was friends with Dr. John, and Dr. John was in the first All-Star Band
That's right. That's right.
touring. But is there any evidence that you can point to that any of the Beatles were definitely listening to that Dr. John recording?
Just that it was very much in the ethos around this time. There are a couple albums I point to that they were listening to, and others were listening to. Fleetwood Mac and Albatross, which
Oh,
is
yeah.
going to influence Sun King.
Yeah.
They were definitely listening to Walter Carlos's Switched on Bach, which influenced some of the Moog synthesizer playing on this album.
Mhm.
But the reason why, well, we know that Paul wanted a swampy feel, quote unquote swampy feel, and we hear those lyrics, and you can listen to the groove, and although he's never specifically said that, it's an inference that I've made that this is an album that people were talking about. It was such a different album. It was very much being listened to by the Beatles and their fellow musicians. And so that's where I draw the inference that there are a couple connections, both lyrically and musically, to that first Dr. John album.
Okay. All right.
Okay. So what we're looking at here is the bounce down of that 4-track to an 8-track. So they just copied the first 4 tracks right over without changing anything. And then on the 5th track, they add a Rhodes piano, which is a pretty new thing in rock and roll. I mean, it's been popular with jazz musicians like Chick Corea and Herbie Hancock, but not a lot of musicians are using, like rock musicians are using it in 1969. But Paul likes the sound. He's adding this electric piano part. You've got more guitars from George on 6 and 7, some percussion, maracas, possibly played by Ringo there, probably. Paul's harmony vocal on track 7, and then the new vocal from John on track 8. And I'm going to isolate some tracks from take 9, which is the final version. And three things to listen for. One is that echo on John's voice when he says, shoot me. The second is you'll hear a guitar part that was cut from the final recording, but you'll hear it here. And then right before George starts his solo, you can actually hear him flip the switch on his guitar. So it goes from a clean sound to a crunchy, distorted, more distorted sound for the solo.
Huh.
Okay. So here it is. Here is Come Together, the final take, starting with that great groove. Again, the drums sound so good on this album. Here's John.
Shoot. Shoot.
Hmm?
He back production. He got walrus gumboot. He got on no
Here's Paul on the
sideboard.
left
He
channel there.
won spinal cracker. He got feet down below his knees.
Listen to the sound of Ringo's drums. You don't have that on any other Beatles album. Here's that guitar part.
Over me.
Now listen for him to switch the guitar switch. Very quick taste of what my deconstructions are like, talking a little bit about coming together. And it's a lot of fun because when you isolate these tracks, I would love to play each one of them all the way through the song because you
Yeah.
hear all these little things that they're doing. And when you put them all together, of course, it's a masterpiece. But hearing them in isolation and then now listening to the final track, you appreciate it so much more, I think.
But what's really interesting is what was buried in the final mix.
Exactly.
Like the few extra times when John just said, come,
Right. That's
come.
right.
You don't hear that. And I love that George lead guitar part that you didn't hear before, that real gritty
That's
part.
right.
I
That's
kind
right.
of wish they left that in.
Yeah, the hardest thing about producing, when I was producing artists, well, the two things. One is working with the artists, the communication, encouraging them, but criticizing them at the same time. That whole dynamic is hard. But the other hard thing that's hard is deciding what to keep and what not to keep. And for the things you keep, how do you want them sitting in the mix?
Right.
And before Abbey Road, they had a mixer called the Red 5.1, and there was really only so much you could do with it. You only had about 8 inputs, I think, 6 or 8 inputs. You could have very limited control over where you put things in the stereo spectrum.
Hmm.
And then you only had EQ, which equalization, which is something that's standard when you mix. They had 2 settings, classical and pop. That was it for the whole mix.
Huh.
And so if you wanted to do anything beyond that, you had to use outboard gear. You had to run stuff into outside gear and back. With this new mixer, the TG12345, every channel has its own EQ. Every channel can be panned wherever you want in the spectrum. And so it gives you more ability to shape the sound so that things sit well in the mix.
Hmm.
And that's why, even like the vocals, as good as they are on Rubber Soul and as beautiful as the 3-part vocals are, when you listen to the vocals on Because, they're just, mind-blowing how beautiful they sound. And they were recorded multiple times, of course, but it's also the sound of that mixer. So,
Interesting. I want to ask you a quick question about EQ
yes.
because when I listen to Back in the USSR, it has more of a, I don't want to call it an AM sound, but it's more of a tinny sound to me. It doesn't have as full a sound as when you go into Dear Prudence, which is really a very full sounding song. Was that all in the EQ?
That was very much in the EQ, yes. And that was, and when you had a rocking song like that with a lot of guitars and drums and so forth, um, it could get a little muddier, and there's a little bit of that. The other thing about that song, though, is that apparently the sound effects of the plane, that the reel they were using for sound effects was also on its last legs. And so the mono mix, the sound effects sound different than the stereo mix because they got to it first, and they had trouble capturing that sound because apparently the sound effect tape was pretty worn out. So that's part of the story of that song. So you also, in addition to having all the instruments and voices, you have these planes flying back and forth, and so that's another reason I think maybe why that mix sounds a little bit denser, if you will, and maybe a little muddier, a little more AM, if you use your
Yeah.
terminology. And then all of a sudden, Dear Prudence, you had that beautiful guitar, and it's such a change
Right.
from back in the USSR. It's a wonderful sequence, to go from one to the other.
It's only in recent years where it's actually started to irritate me. I want back in the USSR to have the full, rich sound that
So
the
have you
rest
heard
of,
Giles's mix of it? I'm curious what you think of that.
yeah, I have to go back and listen again.
I think he did a really nice job of bringing out some of the making the mix sound a little bit better. He doesn't. I mean, you can debate his mixes, but sometimes because he gets to go back to the original tapes, um, and before they're bounced down to other tapes, because every time you do one of these copies, you're working in analog media, so you're losing a
Hmm.
little quality. So back in the USSR had some bouncing because they're still working at 4 track at that point.
Right.
So he has the benefit of going back to the original tracks, copying them now to Pro Tools, and keeping them in a pristine format. And so the quality of some of those recordings, things come out a lot better than they did on the original mix. So again, there are people I know who have different opinions about that, but I think he did a really good job with the White Album tracks.
Okay. I have some problem with remixing. I'm more of a purist, but that's a whole other show.
It is a really interesting debate. Absolutely, I get into it with people all the time about uh, the benefits of remixing, and people say, well, you can always go back to the originals,
That's
but
true.
the remixes are the ones that are going. When you pull it up on iTunes or Spotify, it's the most recent mixes which are going to play. And if you don't like it, you're kind of stuck with it unless you really seek out the older mix. So there's that angle. Um, and there's also, it was mixed at the time on certain equipment for a certain audience. And we have different ears now.
True.
Do you want to, you know, you want to expose this music to a new generation,
Right.
but it's a historical artifact. So I argue both sides. I love the remixes, but I also loved listening to the originals. So
Yeah, so do I. I mean, there's no answer that will satisfy everybody, no matter
that's
how you
right.
look at this. And my argument is you don't know how John and George would feel right now with all this stuff coming out. They could be very fussy, especially George.
Right.
And but then the argument is if they had the same technology back then that we have now,
That's right.
if it would sound more like what Giles is doing. Have you ever
Yeah.
spoken with Giles?
I have not. I actually just met him recently, but we didn't really have a time to talk very much. I met him in Abbey Road.
Yeah.
The only other thing I'd say about that is that even back in the 60s, there wasn't a definitive mix of the song because there was the mono mix, there
Right.
was the stereo mix, then there was the American mix, and some of the foreign labels remixed it too.
Right.
So if you grew up listening to She's a Woman in America,
You
which
had
was
all
just
that reverb.
pound ago, that's not the way the Beatles wanted it, you know? And so, what is a definitive mix? And just because they mixed it in the control room of Studio 2 isn't necessarily how it was going to sound on a car radio. So, it's a really interesting philosophical discussion. Again, maybe another show, but
Could be many shows.
yes.
All right, let's talk about Rubber Soul.
Okay.
But I want to know that whenever I think about Rubber Soul, and this really only came to light with the Beatles recording sessions, I always have that date, October 12th,
That's right.
1965, stuck in my head. And knowing that they had to record an entire album's worth of material plus the single of We
Plus
Can
the
Work It Out.
Christmas album.
Yep. And have it all done so quickly, which is a miracle. But what I'm not sure about, with the exception of Wait, which was left over from Help, and What Goes On, which dates back, well, they attempted it in 1963 during the For Me to You sessions, but it even goes back further from that, from the demo that surfaced a few years ago. But the song was very different then.
Yes, it was.
But from October 12th, were there any songs that the Beatles wrote before the October 12th date other than those two songs, or was everything done from scratch from October 12th?
So we know that some of the songs were in at least in partial form before Rubber Soul. For example, John had written Norwegian Wood, and he debuted it for George Martin on a ski trip, which was earlier that year, and that's well documented.
Yeah,
But it's also pretty well documented that he didn't write that song by himself. Paul contributed the bridge, and according, if you trust Paul, he also was the one who came up with the idea of burning down the house or setting a fire or whatever you think the ending means. That was his. So, and that was pretty typical of the way they were writing around this time. That John would oftentimes have parts of a song, and Paul would contribute the bridge. Or on Michelle,
right.
it was the opposite. On We Can Work It Out, it was the opposite, right? One wrote the verses, one wrote the bridge. So one of the big changes with Rubber Soul was that they are coming into the studio, and John and Paul aren't coming in with this finished song and teaching it to George and Ringo. They're coming in with an idea, maybe a song that's all the way done, but figuring out the arrangement a lot more in the studio. They're taking up more time. Um, they're working now past midnight until early hours of the morning. They had never done that before. All the sessions were before midnight, but Rubber Soul, they're going past midnight.
Hmm.
And a lot of that time, they may go for 7, 8 hours on one song, but it's not all recording, it's figuring out the arrangements. And we know that because we have some outtakes of chatter, like Think for Yourself,
Right.
where you can hear them working on the harmonies and being, coaching on what notes to sing and so forth. So uh, I think that in Rubber Soul, it was the first time where the majority of the material was arranged in the studio. I don't. I think that like some of the songs they recorded on the last day, "You Won't See Me,"
Hmm.
"The Word," which was the day before, weren't finished until like right before the session. I mean, very close to the session. So they were working up to the last minute, and that's why they're reaching back for Wait. That's why they're doing What Goes On. They're pulling these in
Hmm.
because they need 14 songs and the
Right.
single, and the clock is ticking.
Do you know what they touched up on with Wait? What was the difference between Wait, the way
Oh,
it
I
sounded
do
during
know that.
Help?
It was very minimal. Let me see if I have a note about that. Um, I know they added some more percussion, and I think I'm trying to remember if the piano was on the earlier version. I think it was a little more guitar and a little more piano, and maybe backing vocals. It wasn't that much. It was not that much, and they did that on November 15th. Well, on November 11th, which was the last day. So they did 4 songs on that day. You Won't See Me, Girl, the new version of I'm Looking Through You, and Wait. And so it was a lot to get done for that day. But they didn't have. That was it. That was deadline.
Yeah. Perhaps the most fascinating thing for me when I listen to different takes is hearing an evolution of a song. And I remember, like you brought up Come Together, when take one appeared on the anthology, I said, that's pretty close to the original here. It's like they
Yeah,
already knew the arrangement
that's
by the
right.
time they started it.
Right.
But it's kind of interesting that late in the game, they knew how the song was going to be, whereas with Rubber Soul, many of the songs they had to develop.
That's
in the
that's
studio.
exactly right. Yeah, yeah. And a great example of that is I'm Looking Through You, right? We've heard the version on the anthology, which is really cool with the hand claps and everything, but the
Right,
song doesn't even have a bridge at that
right,
point. And then it's somewhere in between that date and the final sessions, the song was completely rearranged and the bridge was added. So we're not sure, again, anecdotally, there's stories about We Can Work It Out was finished before they went into the studio and things like that.
uh,
But there were definitely fragments of songs. A lot of work was done in the studio. And by the way, We Can Work It Out, they had to mix it. They were doing a show called The Music of Lennon and McCartney
right,
on the first days of November, and they had to have a mix done that they could mime to. But when McCartney heard it, he didn't like it, and so they went back and redid all the vocals after The Music of Lennon and McCartney. So um, they were still making changes. It's not the same as previous albums where, for the most part, when they came in, they did however many takes they were going to do, maybe a couple overdubs, and then they moved on. For the most part, with Rubber Soul, it's sort of the opposite. For the most part, they're not necessarily um, coming in working just one day on a song, or if they are, there's a lot of time being spent fleshing out the arrangement, trying different things, and so forth.
right. I know in your presentation, which by the way, I didn't even point out, you're wearing the shirt,
I
the
am, yes.
E4 Fest 2025. We just went to a great festival over the weekend in Asbury Park, at the Berkeley
Oceanfront Hotel.
Front Hotel, and it was for the 60th anniversary of Rubber Soul, and you presented Deconstructing Rubber Soul there. But at the very end, you were talking about You Won't See Me, and you said that the chord progressions of the song are very much the same as It's the Same Old Song. I
Yes.
know in recent years, because I just asked Ken Womack this question when he was on Talk More Talk, a lot of people point to You Won't See Me as being a Motown type song. I never heard that in my head. Just like I never heard Can't Buy Me Love had a country and western feel to it. To me, it was always rock. Where is
Uh-huh.
this country and western coming from? And now, once you hear that, you try to think that way. But with You Won't See Me, I mean, I know Paul loved James Jamerson,
Yes.
so and they all love Motown. But can you really say without any dispute that it was taken from It's the Same Old Song?
Yes. Yes. Now, but let me qualify. Did he listen to Four Tops and say, I'm going to copy that song? No. But just like for I Saw Her Standing There, where they borrowed the bass line from I'm Talking About You from Chuck Berry,
Yeah,
he borrowed James Jamerson's bass line, and it's the same four chords. It's the same old song, it's the same four chords. And the Four Tops had done that themselves because they had a song called Sugar Pie Honey Bunch.
right. I can't help myself.
And then the next song, it's the same old song, which they called It's the Same Old Song because it was the exact same chords as Sugar Pie Honey Pie. And we won't see me. The verse is the same exact chords. And um, and then if you isolate the bass, you hear Paul McCartney doing a very, very similar line to what James Jamerson did. And I'll show you that on in New Haven on Thursday because I'm going to play the bass line side by side, and you'll hear there's no question Paul was paying tribute to it. And then he has a quote where he says, "Look, it was James Jamerson in Detroit, Brian Wilson on the West Coast, and me, Paul McCartney, and we were the ones who were being the most creative, all coming from different angles, but we were all listening to one another."
Okay. But you see, now when I listen to You Won't See Me, I'm going to go into it with that thought in mind, which
Uh-huh.
is different from, to me, it was a straight ahead, fantastic pop song, but I
Yeah.
never
I
associated with,
love that song. But
yeah,
next time you listen to it, sing It's the Same Old Song over top the verse, and you'll see it's the exact same same pattern. Now Paul goes into a different place with it,
yeah.
and the arrangement is different, and the backing vocals are great. It's a wonderful arrangement. But he made a little Motown tribute.
And of course, John sang It's the same old song in the Beatles' Christmas message.
That's right.
That's proof. They took
That's
it
right.
from that song.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
George Harrison made fun of I Can't Help Myself
That's
in
right.
this song.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So a lot of this also is you have to look like with the Dr. John, right? What's in the ethos around that time, right? So like I show an example, I show that um, Ringo's drum solo on the end is very similar to Ron Bushy from Iron Butterfly
Uh-huh.
in Agata Davida. And when I read that, my first reaction was, that's ridiculous. Then I heard, then I, when I listened to the solo, I went, well, it does sound kind of similar. And then I read a quote where Ringo actually said, yeah, I took it from Ron Bushy. So, um, but, I've read some books where they say the Beatles got this from such and such a song, and that song hadn't been released yet.
Right.
So this is part of the forensic musicology. You have to kind of look what's going on. What would they have been listening to? Would they have been exposed to that? And clearly, there's plenty of proof they listened to the Four Tops and they listened to James Jamerson. So,
See, that's what I need. I need a quote like what Ringo just said. That really helps. Because so
yes,
many things, Mark Lewison's book, Tune In, he mentions Ask Me Why. And he said that the beginning of it sounds like one of Smokey Robinson and the Miracles B-sides.
yes, yes.
And they do sound similar, but I never heard John Lennon ever say it.
Hmm.
So it's like, I wish we had proof of John. How do you even know he listened? But the Beatles listened to B-sides too.
That's right. They sure did. Um, the both songs have that both "Ask Me Why" and "What's So Good About Goodbye," which is the song you're referring
Okay.
to. That came out in December '61, so right around the time "Ask Me Why" was written. They both have similar guitar figures at the beginning. They both use falsetto at the end of their verses. They both use the word "misery." Smokey Robinson sings "All I've Known Is Misery." Lennon sings "I Can't Conceive of Any More Misery." So you put that together, and again, I've done a whole show on that I've called the Beatles Knickers, of all the songs where the Beatles kind of might have nicked from someone else. But that's the way music works. You don't have to copy someone, but you can take ideas or influences from other people and make it your own. And that's what the Beatles did so well,
Right.
because it's not a ripoff of a Smokey Robinson song, but it certainly could have elements inspired by Smokey Robinson.
Yeah. So when studying Rubber Soul, what would you say are or were the most complex songs or most difficult songs for the Beatles to record for that album?
So, Think for Yourself was definitely one that they had a lot of difficulty because of the harmonies. George's chords are really cool on that song. It's a really unusual chord progression,
Yeah.
and singing three-part harmony goes along with the chords. I think probably they were. I mean, you can hear on the outtakes that they worked that out quite a bit, and probably George Martin might have even come down and helped them out a little bit with that. So that was one. Um, I'm just thinking, running through the album really quickly. Um, I mean, I know that songs like Michelle, the question was, what do we do with this? Just like, what do we do with Yesterday? And the determination with Yesterday was, it's Paul, right? There's nothing really we can add. With Michelle, it's, well, what is Ringo going to play on this song? And he comes up with this really nice little pattern. In My Life is another one. Like if you picture In My Life with a different drum beat, it's not In My Life. That the drum beat that Ringo came up with makes that song. And
He borrowed that from
from
borrowed.
Anna,
Yeah,
yeah,
it's really the same.
yeah, yeah. So I think that most of the songs, were no more than 2 or 3 days worth of work. Starting and coming back to it. Again, I'm trying to think through my car. Norwegian Wood is another one, because it's clear from the very beginning that John liked the idea, and they all liked the idea of having a sitar. That was kind of, they're always looking for new sounds. So cool. It works with the song. The song kind of is over a drone. That's the sitar fits perfectly. But how do they use it? And it's an instrument that can overtake everything. which is why the Yardbirds were going to use it for Heart Full of Soul, and they ended up not using it because they couldn't get the musicians to the Indian musicians to play it with Western rhythms and get it all fitting in the mix together. So the earlier takes of Norwegian Wood, George Harrison's playing sitar all the way through, and wisely they kind of cut that back and said, let's my words, let's use it tastefully. Let's
Mm.
use a little phrase here, a little phrase here in the solo, and it's so much better when it's used in that way in that song. So that one, even though they only did 4 takes, they spent a lot of time thinking about really how the sitar fit. The song didn't change that much,
Hmm.
um, but the sitar part did.
Right. How about the introduction of Drive My Car? It's so weird.
It is very
Timing
weird.
that.
Yeah.
Was that a
Um,
struggle for the band to do that, or
so it's unclear to me how they came up with it. There are videos online you can find of how to count it.
yeah.
But it requires them all to sort of be thinking in slightly different ways, and uh, it's unclear whether that was a happy accident that they all kind of sort of locked in together by the time of the first thing, or they were really all counting this way. Um, you have to start the song with the guitar comes in not on the beat, but a little off the beat,
Hmm.
and then it starts to make sense. But yeah, it is really it's a weird one.
Okay. I love it.
It's
I would
great.
imagine
Yeah.
a lot of Beatles tribute bands must struggle to just be right on time with
Yes.
that.
Yeah.
So,
It's an interesting, when at the conference, um, uh, Rob Sheffield was talking about Rubber Soul, and he said for him, it's the American Rubber Soul. And of course, we all know people who say it's American Rubber Soul, but the way he described the American Rubber Soul and how it kicks off with "I've Just Seen a Face" with those triplets, dum dum da 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 da, da, and what a great album start. And I think "Drive My Car," that guitar lick at the beginning, what a great album start. So it depends, I guess, what you're used to, but I think the way that the way the British Rubber Soul starts with "Drive My Car" is just wonderful, and it just kicks in with that riff and which is an Otis Redding, that's a Stax inspired riff, um, and it's just wonderful.
okay, one last song, Girl.
Yes,
How did they come up with the idea? I didn't even think about this until Paul brought it up in interviews about how they wanted to have that Greek sound on the guitar. I never associated it with Greek music.
yes, yes.
But
So
yeah.
So that's another one that I tried to get to the bottom of because there are Beatles books that will say that George Harrison played a bouzouki, which is a Greek string instrument, and George was always trying to find new instruments, and that he played a bouzouki, and he may have experimented with one. They had been to Greece. Um, to me, the most interesting thing I found is that Zorba the Greek had been released not long before Rubber Soul.
Hmm.
And the theme to Zorba the Greek was a hit.
Right.
So it's certainly possible that um, that all came into play. But the way they got that sound was not a bouzouki. I'm fairly certain it was a guitar, but it was capoed at the eighth fret. And for any guitarist, you know that when you capo at the eighth fret, that leaves very little string to play, and it makes it kind of sound a little more metallic-y. And if you try taking, any acoustic guitar, capo it at eighth fret, and play the part from Girl, it's like,
Hmm.
oh yeah, that's how you get that sound. So that's what I think happened. There's no record, there's no photos, there's nothing that they said about playing a bouzouki. It's just Beatles authors have said they played a bouzouki, but I'm you know pretty sure it was not a bouzouki.
But in your mind and in a lot of fans' minds, did they think this is a Greek sound when they heard it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean the pattern again. If you compare, this is another one of those things where you have to listen to Zorba the Greek, and then listen to the part from Girl, and it's not exact, but it's a similar feel, similar rhythm. Dun 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 dun. The way you walk up the scale and you alternate back and forth, that's a very Greek thing. So George has to do a solo. So he comes up with an idea. So where does that come from? Well, he thinks about what he's been listening to, or something he heard on the radio, or you know something he just saw in the theater, or whatever it was. But he comes up with that, and it just happened to work with the song. There's nothing. It's not a Greek girl, as far as I know, but it happened to fit. And I'm sure John got to say, "I like it" or "I don't like it," and John must have said, "That sounds really cool." But there's nothing that George Harrison has ever said that I have found of how, why he came up with that particular solo. George Martin taught me the solo. There's none of that.
Mm.
But so how does he come up with that? Well, he bases it on all his music knowledge and maybe what's kind of front and center on the day he records it. And it could very well have been something he saw that reminded him of Greece or Zorba the Greek, or he might have just been fooling around playing the tune at home,
Uh-huh.
figuring out the piece, and that's what happened.
A lot of this stuff could be spontaneous. And
Yeah,
as Paul has said a few times, sometimes if you have a mistake, leave it in.
they did that a lot. They did a
Yeah,
lot. Think of how many times, feeling 2 foot small, right? Or that was an absolute mistake. And John said, that's, let's leave that in. So there's all kinds of things like that. There are many early on when you had tape that was expensive and you didn't have time to re-record things, and they're double tracking their voices. They're recording their same part twice.
right.
John was always notoriously bad at that. So you hear lots of little differences. By this point, they could always redo a takeover again. So they've decided that it's not that big a deal, or they kind of think it's neat to do that. And so you find those little discrepancies. That's part of what makes the music fun, and not computer generated. It's because it's live, it's spontaneous. There are mistakes, but mistakes that make the song interesting.
Right. All right. Can you just very briefly, because we had talked earlier about the use of music and what you do. I know there's a lot of people, especially podcasters, who are wondering because, these days you have to walk on eggshells when it comes to putting music into videos and everything.
Yes.
What you can get away with, is it strictly because it's instructional? Is there any difference between what you do when you do in a live show as opposed to what you do in the DVD? That kind of thing. Can you briefly explain all that?
Yes. So I'll give you a very high level overview, and obviously it's a very complex issue. But um, first of all, the idea that you can play 30 seconds of music is absolutely not true.
Hmm,
Um, the the law that we're talking about is something called, or the type of law is something called fair use.
right.
And I'm not a lawyer. I just play one on TVs. But I will tell you, my understanding of fair use is that it means that you're adding some kind of a additional material, oftentimes of an educational nature, to the material. You're not just playing a song. You're narrating. You're talking about it, and so forth. And so everything I do that I record, YouTube, TV, films, gets run by lawyers, and they will tell me, this song you can play 5 seconds, this one you can play a minute,
Hmm,
but it has to do with what I'm talking about, what I'm illustrating, and you have to be adding content. You can't just play a song to play a song. I can't just say listen to Paul's bass part and let it play. I have to say, here are 3 things to listen for on the bass part. And
hmm,
then once I've illustrated those, that's it. Live is a little different. Technically, it should all be covered under the same rules, but you get a little more leeway, I think, when you're doing a live lecture, as an educational lecture. Even though it's fun, it's also obviously educational. And even there, I make sure people know this is I'm doing this under fair use for educational purposes, and I'm just playing music not to say let's all listen to the album together. I'm playing it for a specific reason.
hmm.
So but you do have to be very careful, as you know, when posting things online or when putting things in movies or films. And composers deserve to be treated fairly, writers and publishers. Um, I think I would love there to be more license for educational purposes, but I'm very happy with what the lawyers have let me do. Um, and but everything I do is checked by attorneys.
Yeah. I have to wonder because for so many years, the Beatles during Neil Aspinall's reign were so protective of their
Yes.
legacy.
Yeah.
You know, now we're living at a time where you can hear isolated tracks of what they're doing, and it's far beyond any comprehension of what we thought there ever would be.
Exactly.
How the Beatles themselves, Paul, Ringo, the Lennon estate, the Harrison estate, how they feel about all that.
Yeah.
Maybe that's even forcing them to be more creative, especially on the Lennon um,
Absolutely. Yeah.
archival box sets to do things like that. But I
Hmm.
do wonder if it's like if they think, well, you're going too far. This is our own private stuff, what we worked on, our own sweat here, and now you're picking it apart, knowing every detail.
Right.
So,
I also think there is a a change in thinking. I I hope, I certainly sense it in that they want this music to go to the next generation and the generation after that and the generation after that. And so the more that their music is being out there and discussed and analyzed and taken apart and put back together, the more of us who are talking about it and doing shows about it and podcasts and radio, the more it's staying in the public mind.
right,
And I think there is something very, very positive about that of, well, these people are out there talking about it. They're not bashing us. They're really doing it because they love the music. They love what we did, and they want other people to love it too. And I'm hopeful that means there will be more, especially as things move to the next generation of the Beatles,
hmm,
the next, the sons and daughters of the actual Beatles and their kids, that there will be a little more flexibility in releasing material and how people can use it. Um, but I think that what we do gets people interested in the music, and it's a good thing for them because they want the music to survive.
I
So
agree. When you think there was once a time when the Beatles objected to the Sessions album coming out,
yeah, yeah,
look where we've come since then.
exactly,
So,
exactly.
so can you just tell me, beyond the show next Thursday at the Schubert Theater in New Haven, what your plans are for other shows? And would you ever consider going beyond the group and doing something on the solo careers like this?
Well, funny you mentioned that. So this year I've been touring a Dark Side of the Moon show,
Hmm.
which is really fun. And I've done that all over the US and Canada. It probably will not be on TV, but I do it live and it's a lot of fun. And I'm thinking right now that my next show will be a solo show. And my first entree into that world, um, and you know, don't quote me on this, but I'm thinking of a Beatles 70s 71 show rather than take just one album like All Things Must Pass. I think the audience would be receptive to something where I'm playing, little Plastic Ono Band, little McCartney, little All Things Must Pass, little Sentimental Journey, and talking about what's going on in the Beatles camp after the breakup. So that's my thought right now. I could certainly do an All Things Must Pass show, a Band on the Run show, an Imagine show.
Yeah,
Um, but I also have to be thinking about my audiences and getting people to come. And there might be a better draw to be able to talk about what they're all doing. So we'll see. That's at least that's what I'm thinking about for next year.
I wonder how Paul and Ringo and the Lennon estate and the Harrison estate feel about that,
Yeah.
that it would all be grouped together as
Yeah.
the solo music. So, but that's what I've been doing on the radio for God knows.
Exactly, exactly. Well, that's what your podcast does so well, and I think, as certainly you do, that there's so much good music in their solo careers, And there's a lot that people just don't know about, and I think it would be great to find a way to bring that to people as well. I mean, I know Paul's trying to do that with his, with Wings and everything, but there's a lot of great music, and it deserves to be heard. And I'm hoping that, just like you do with Talk More Talk, I'd love that to be, I'd love to be able to help with that.
Oh, anytime you want to come on.
Okay.
Same thing
Thank
with
you.
things we said today and here.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Um,
So I'm including the link for deconstructing the music, not deconstructing the Beatles, but deconstructingthemusic.com, which has all the information you need to know about Scott, what he does. The DVDs are on there. And if you want to purchase tickets for the show at the Schubert Theater in New Haven, which is next Thursday on the 20th, starting at 7 p.m., and I'm supposed to be introducing you.
Yes, you are. Yes, you are. And all my movies are available for streaming also, so you can get that on my site. There are also lots of YouTube videos and more about other things that I'm doing. And of course, we're gonna have a lot of fun on next Thursday, walking through the 30 days it took to make Revolver and going day by day and seeing that amazing album come to life.
I mean, Rubber Soul.
Rubber Soul, sorry, yes.
It's okay. One last thing. Are the copyright laws different if you wanted to do this in Europe or
Yes. Very
okay.
much so. Yes. So the fair use laws are actually stricter overseas. So it's something we've looked into, but right now, although I do have people who purchase from overseas, we're really focused on the States. We've only gotten the lawyers to approve for the United States. Let's put it that way.
Okay. I know Mark Lewison's been doing this
Yes, he
presentation
has.
on 1963,
Hmm.
imagining he's using the Beatles music, so
He is. He's doing live presentations. He did one on Abbey Road called Hornsby Road and things,
right,
but he does them live. They're not filmed.
right.
And again, there's a little more license when you do it live, even if the audience is paying. It's not that you can't get sued, but it's there's a little more tolerance for it, because people are coming for a lecture, for a presentation that's educational. But if he were to try to film his lectures, which I would love to see, but
Hmm.
I think it would be very, very hard.
Okay. Folks, if you can, try to see the show next Thursday at the Schubert Theater in New Haven. And once again, the website is there in the description box. Thank you, Scott, for doing this.
Thank you very much for having
In
me,
this
Ken. This has been great.
description box right now. You look at it. It was great having you here, and we'll talk again soon. I hope to see all of you next Thursday night. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Take
Bye
care.
bye.